about. In fact, it's the last midrash in Midrash Rabbah on the Torah, and it says, if you get up in the morning and you do not say Birkat Yotzei Or, or you go to bed at night and you do not say the Bracha Mariv Aravim, it is as if you have forfeited your life, Chayev B'nafsho, or a different language in that regard, but it's rather dramatic language. So this is not a novel interpretation. In essence, it goes back to Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, a great hero of all of us involved in environmental issues, or any kind, I would say, of ethical issue. Arguably the most illustrious thinker of the previous century, modern Orthodox thinker, and who points out what we know to be the essence, the essential message of a bracha. What is a bracha? Before we eat or drink or even smell a fragrance, we are obliged, according to Jewish law, to pause for a moment and to recite a certain formula, a blessing. What are we doing when we recite that? We are essentially recognizing, first and foremost, that there is a source of all that makes it possible for us to be able to have this pleasure that we are about to partake of, and that we are not taking it for granted. In other words, a bracha is, in essence, what today has become a very popular word in modern spirituality, in the broader sense of the word. It's mindfulness. It means that you don't do things automatically, that you don't take them for granted. There's an awareness and appreciation of what you're doing. And therefore the Midrash in essence is saying is if you can get up in the morning and see the beauty of sunrise, or you go to bed at night after having seen the exquisite glory of sunset, and there is no bracha, there is no appreciation, you take it all for granted, it's of no consequence, doesn't impact on you, then you may as well not be here. It's mitchayev nafsho. It's as if you're not physically living, because you're not aware of the divine presence in the world. You're not engaging with life, in essence. You're just a zombie. And that, I would say, is the most beautiful midrashic metaphor for the whole of what Judaism is trying to do. You know, in fact, the idea that we should make 100 brachot every day, which Chazal say, playing on the words of in the Tanakh, is emphasizing again that our day should be full of mindfulness, and we should be therefore aware, not taking things for granted. And Judaism relates that to every aspect of life. So what Pope Francis, incidentally, Pope Francis in his Laudato Si, which has won, thank God, has achieved enormous publicity, and he is a great hero for us, for all of those involved, if you like, in spiritual engagement, environmental issues, just for your information, is nothing new, even for the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict brought out a whole book, published a whole book dealing with the question of environmental and ecological issues long before Laudato Si. And Laudato Si is essentially based upon Benedict's writing substantially. But there are mysteries in the world. One person is gifted with an image that the media pick up on of one kind. Another, if you like, is cursed with another kind of image that the media pick up on. Some people can get their thoughts out in a way that others can't. And Pope Francis has therefore been able to galvanize certain insights that were already there. And in essence, the spiritual vision of what he calls an integral ecology is what Judaism is all about. It's all about being conscious, aware, sensitive and responsive to every aspect of life, and our relationship with every aspect of the cosmos. First and foremost, our relationships with one another. So when it comes to a klal gadol b'Torah, what is the most important principle? You know, there's the famous discussion between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai, which in essence isn't very much different as to whether it's love your neighbor yourself or the fact that human beings created in the divine image. And that's also the subject for many wonderful reflections. But there, first and foremost, is our relationship with one another. If people's concern for animal welfare, which I'm going to speak about, or even for the preservation of species, is at the expense of focus on human dignity and human welfare, then it's a distortion and a perversion, even I would say a form of idolatry. But when it is in sync with our sensibilities towards humanity and towards our neighbours, then it expands it and it gives it the fullness of living in that awareness of the divine in the world at large. So this relates to all aspects. And there are many obvious areas. I mean, the most dramatic one that is most obvious, from, if you like, from an ecological environmental issue, I would say probably the most obvious. Certainly it's seen within Jewish tradition as the most central, and I would say as a precept, as a mitzvah, it's probably the most defining, and that is the Shabbat. In fact, I remember the late Pinchas Peli of blessed memory saying, "Tell me what a Jew's Shabbat is like, and I'll tell you what kind of Jew she or he is." There's probably nothing as defining of Jewish identity as how an individual observes the Shabbat. And the Shabbat is a very obvious ecological environmental precept in terms of being conscious, therefore, of the creation as a whole, that in the course of our weekday creativity, which is our blessed gift from the divine, nevertheless we can get so caught up in our creativity that we can actually become a tunnel focus and lacking an awareness of the breadth of the cosmos and even of society around us. So Shabbat is a restoration of our equilibrium. But perhaps the most encompassing in terms of the precepts and the various requirements, both in a daily and even more expansive life, is the area of kashrut. And kashrut concerns our whole relationship with both the animate and to some extent even the inanimate world. But it's specifically in relation to the animate world I want to focus because the ramifications are enormous. And I would like to start off with a very famous midrash, very famous homiletical comment on the part of our sages that appears both in Bereshit Rabbah and Vayikra Rabbah, and it is also to be found in the Tanchuma, which is a later collection of midrashic material, which says the following. What does God care whether a man kills an animal in a proper Jewish way and eats it, or whether he strangles an animal and then eats it? Will the one benefit him or the other injure him? What does God care whether a man eats kosher or a non-kosher animal? Doesn't it say, if you are wise for yourself, but if you scorn, you alone shall bear it? So you learn that the commandments were only given to refine God's creatures. As it is written, God's word is refined, it is a protection to those who trust in him. The purpose, which is of course just the other side of what I was saying before in terms of mindfulness, the purpose of the mitzvot is to refine the human spirit. It is to make us more sensible, more aware of the world in which we live. And therefore it has specific focus in relation to animal life. In keeping with this text, Ramban emphasizes that the whole purpose of Shechita and the laws of Kashrut are designed to make us more compassionate. Of course, there is a big conundrum in this, especially which we will raise in a moment, especially for me as a vegan, I would say for all vegetarians. We'll deal with it in a moment. But nevertheless, he sees that, like other mitzvot in the Torah, including Shiluach Haken, the casting out of the mother bird before you take the eggs from the nest, if you want to therefore eat the eggs, all as designed to develop human compassion. It is to make us more sensitive human beings. This is, of course, a famous debate between Ramban Nachmanides and Rambam Maimonides. Maimonides actually says that these commandments are for the creatures themselves, so that the creatures don't suffer. Nachmanides poo-poos that. He doesn't think that this parallel is relevant to associate or identify animals, as it were, with human feelings in the same way. But nevertheless, he is absolutely adamant that the purpose of these commandments are once again to refine the human person, to make them more sensitive. And even for Maimonides, who says that this has to do with the creatures themselves, Maimonides too reiterates exactly that idea of Nachmanides as well, that the commandments are there to ennoble us, to make us better people, to make us more sensitive human beings. And if they don't, then there's a problem. A serious problem if they're not doing that. Of course, problems that we confront and we see often today, where very often people can observe the letter of law and completely desecrate its spirit. And that's classical religious hypocrisy, but that's always been around. That's a part of the human condition. But here are two quotes from Maimonides. The object of the prohibition against causing an animal pain, so you know that is a prohibition in the Torah against Tsar Balei Chayim. It is prohibited for us to cause suffering to animals, is in order to perfect us, so that we should not acquire habits of cruelty and should not inflict pain gratuitously, without any utility, but we should be kind and merciful to all living creatures, except in the case of need. So, this already is beginning to raise the big question, which we're coming to in more detail. That's a quotation from the Guide to the Perplexed. And in Hilchot Tmura, at the end of Hilchot Tmura, in his Yad HaChazaka, in his magnum opus, his code, he says, most laws of the Torah are simply good guidance from the greatest guide in order to improve our traits, direct all our actions with integrity. Every single one of the 613 commandments serves to inculcate an authentic philosophy of life, to repudiate a pernicious ideology, and to promote justice, eradicate injustice, to cultivate morality and avoid evil conduct. So this gives us, therefore, the overall context, in keeping with the teachings of our sages with regards to the important, and keeping with the teachings of the Torah, with regards to the prohibition against causing cruelty to animals, and our responsibility towards the animate world around us. So, just a few last comments just to emphasize this central point, and that is compassion is actually seen as the defining trait of the Jewish people. In fact, the famous quotation of our sages appears in a number of places, that the true children of Abraham, our father, are modest, compassionate, and perform acts of charitable towards one another. So I don't know how many of us will fully fall under the category of authentic children of Abraham, but at least we know what we should be striving for. To the point that the Talmud says in Tractate Betzah, if you come across somebody who is not compassionate, then it raises a question as to the person's provenance, whether they really are a child of Abraham or not. I don't think the sages wanted us to be able to deal, as unfortunately some of my colleagues do, with tracing lineage to be specific as to whom they are descended from. It is more a comment about what the character of a Jew or of an authentic child of Abraham should be. Above all, somebody who is compassionate. And one who is not compassionate, therefore, if you like, if we can use dramatic language, is a traitor to their ancestry, by virtue or by the lack of virtue of their particular conduct. Okay, so the Talmud is full with examples. Of course, the Torah is already example with the ideal of compassion. When Abraham sends Eliezer, the man who is in charge of his household, to look for a suitable spouse for his son Yitzchak, Isaac, and he finds Rivka. The defining quality, of course, is she shows his compassion towards animals as well as to human beings. And there are plenty of stories that our sages expound with regards to Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, with regards to David HaMelech, to show their suitability, whether it was Moses or King David, for their particular positions, and even certain criticisms of some of the greater sages, arguably the greatest of the sage who redacted the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, for failure to be compassion, to show even extra compassion beyond the letter of the law towards animal life. So now we come to the big question. It's very clear that the Torah allows for the consumption of animal flesh, let alone of products. Therefore, where is the boundary between this permission and our responsibility towards sentient beings in the world? And this is, of course, something that has been deliberated upon by our sages over the ages extensively. And as I already quoted Maimonides says, codifies, therefore, the Talmudic discussions on this, as saying it's obviously clear that it is prohibited to cause suffering to animals, except where there is need. Well, how do you define need? And exactly what is need in that regard? So this is a source of enormous debate, and there is no simple answer. There are different grades of interpretation in this regard. I think we can come to say some things categorically today, because today the situation actually makes it possible to be more categorical than ever before, which, if you're not aware of, I'm sure most of you are, but I will elaborate a little bit upon. But historically it's very dubious as to exactly what that means, and we have different sources within our commentators, earlier and later ones, as to how far this legitimate need may go. One of the earlier sources, Rabbi Isserlin of Torat Chayim, is extremely expansive in his permit for what is considered to be legitimate human need in that regard. Where there are others who, for example, the Yad HaLevi was later in the 19th century, this Torat Chayim was much earlier, the Rabbi Isolin was about 200 years earlier, but the Yad HaLevi is actually more restrictive in terms of the permits he gives. And he even goes and claims that this is a debate going back to the earlier sources, which he traces along. In other words, it would seem from the way he expounds it that this is a debate that's been going on for a long time and continues to be going on for a long time. So there are other interesting terms here with regards to what is how far we may go. One of the great sources in 19th century, which is Rabbi Jacob Yaakov Ettlinger of Binyan Zion, he uses a term to'elet muchletet, absolute need. In other words, when it's something where it's clear that this is essential, but that still begs the question as to what is essential. It's still very not definitive. In modern times, for example, well, it's not so modern. Already in the late 18th, early 19th century, you have commentators like the Chochmat Adam, who is the famous, if you like, concise code of Jewish law, and even before him, the Bach, Rabbi Sirkis of the 17th century, who are explicit about the fact that pâté de foie gras, even then, goose liver, is absolutely halachically forbidden. Absolutely, because it's absolutely clear that you can live a perfectly good, healthy life without having to eat goose liver. And therefore the idea of fattening up geese, at least the way it was done then, by which they are actually buried in the ground and force-fed until essentially they were no longer able to function because of the expansion of their liver, that was considered to be, by some authorities, to be legitimate. For them, it's very clear that it was totally illegitimate. And then in modern times, this is actually confirmed by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who rules that particular way, or Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Yehuda Waldenberg, who also ruled categorically against the production of veal. It's really interesting that these sources have ruled against the production of veal, but veal continues to be commonplace in Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox celebrations. But the production of veal is very categorically a violation in terms of the cruelty involved. It requires taking this calf and making sure that the calf doesn't see the light of day so that its flesh is as white as possible, very often chaining it up in most cases, or constricting it so it can't be mobile, for human indulgence for the delicacy of veal. And so you've had major authorities that say this is absolutely not kosher. Still continue to see the veal on the menu of kosher establishments, and sometimes within the most illustrious rabbinic company. How that could be justified is beyond me. And then there are very explicit rulings, both by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, but perhaps most dramatically by Rabbi Chaim David HaLevi, who was at one time the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and died, I suppose it must be now 20 years ago, 20 or 25 years ago, were against the use of fur. Because he could not find any justification for the cruelty involved that could justify wearing fur. So all of this raises a question, the big question for us today. And what is essential need? And it's clear that in the past, it was not possible in most places where Jews lived to be able to get all your nutrients and have a healthy, balanced diet without having animal products, especially, I would say, in Eastern Europe, in terms of also weather conditions, certain times of the year. These were things. Today, we have the opportunity to have healthy nutrients and a well-balanced diet without needing to be able to consume animal products. But there are some bigger issues simply than whether it is to'elet muchletet or even whether it is legitimate need. And that, as I say, make the situation far more dramatic today than it was in past generations. In fact, this was my particular journey, because even though as a young boy I remember saying that I didn't think it was very nice to eat animals, nevertheless I was brought up in a carnivorous diet and environment, and once you bring people into that particular environment, I suppose it's like drugs, I don't know, and not having ever experienced, you can easily get hooked on it. And I became a big meat consumer. And I used to say, well, it doesn't seem right to me, but I like meat much too much. Until I became rabbi in South Africa, I was rabbi at a very young age of the largest Orthodox congregation there. In fact, it's probably, as opposed to some of the news items in which we see that Rabbi Shire is claiming to be the rabbi of the largest Orthodox congregation in the world, my congregation in Cape Town was larger. We had 2,500 members people within the congregation, and on a Shabbat we would have, in the summer, 1,500 in shul on Shabbat. It would go down to about half the amount in winter, but that's still a significant congregation. At any rate, there was written into the constitution of the Cape Bet Din that because this was the largest congregation, a rabbi of that congregation was automatically a dayan on the Bet Din, served on the Bet Din. And as a result, I was a member, therefore, of the rabbinic court at, I'd say, a rather ridiculously young age. And one of the responsibilities of the members of the dayanim were spot checks on the shochtim, on the slaughterers. And so one fine day, I'm told that we're, by the head of the Bet Din, that we're going to the slaughterhouse. I'd never been in the slaughterhouse in my life before. And we go in, and the checks themselves were very simple. I mean, you actually still today, for the checkup on the slaughterer, is to run your nail over the blade, and if there is an indentation of any kind on the nail, the slightest glitch whatsoever that will be, therefore would show up, then the slaughterer is suspended, and if it's recurrent, he will be fired. I would like to add, so that I'm not misunderstood in any way, that I am personally convinced that of all the methods of slaughtering animal today, the kosher method is the most humane. And, well, it seems to me almost a contradiction to talk of humane slaughter. Let me perhaps then use another language. It's the least inhumane. And that is because when I was visiting the slaughterhouse there, in Cape Town, the kosher area of slaughter was an adjunct of the general slaughterhouse. That was how it was economically viable at that particular time. It was actually, just if you're interested in it, it meant that if there was an agreement between, therefore, the Jewish community and the general slaughterhouses, that if there was any problem with the animal in terms of Jewish law, that any of its internal organs were not according to halachic requirements, that animal was not wasted. It would then go to the non-Jewish part of the community, of the society, that did not have these restrictions with regards to inner organs of the animal, and therefore they could consume it. But this meant I was able to see what goes on in the general slaughterhouses. And what I saw, this is a very bad pun, stunned me. I went in there and I saw that for the general slaughtering process, there is an electrocution of the animals first. And what happens is there are these electrical nodes that hang down from the ceiling, from electrodes, and as the animal comes along, they're banged against the head from both sides by somebody who's there. It's actually mobile, so you swing it against it. The animal is stunned, and then it's poleaxed from behind the head. But and here is part of the real problem, one of the major factors of this whole problematic aspect of this modern food industry, is that in order to meet the demand, the pressures are enormous to be able to produce the maximal amount of slaughtered animals. Therefore, the animals are being chased into this narrow line, being whipped into a frenzy to force them through as fast as possible. And this poor fellow there, he's got these electrodes that go boom, 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 boom as quickly as he can. And of course, you can't guarantee that you're getting the cow correctly on the place in order to be able to immobilize it, in order to be able to stun it. And therefore, he is very often missing stunning it properly. And if the animals are often passing through in this process, which in theory might be more humane, I don't think it is, though, because there are plenty of other aspects to be able to discuss as to what causes really the cessation of brain activity and therefore the lack of the sense of pain. But nevertheless, even if it was, the pressures of the market mean that it's not being done effectively. Whereas the kosher slaughter is aesthetically far less attractive, but nevertheless it means that the animal, if you like, is getting personal attention from the slaughterer. The animal, therefore, you've got to be able to slaughter it and make sure that you've severed the trachea and esophagus. It therefore has to be laid down. There are ways of doing it that are nicer and ways that are less nice, and and there are some problematic aspects, according to the hoist and shackle, for those of you who might be familiar with that. But nevertheless, certainly in terms of the act of slaughtering, I'm absolutely convinced that kosher slaughter is far more compassionate than what takes place in terms of the area of mass slaughter. But nevertheless, for me, this experience was quite traumatic. What I saw I wouldn't want to do, and first and foremost, it posed an immediate moral challenge for me. If this is something I wouldn't want to do, is it right for me to benefit from somebody else who's doing it for me? But then I became, in addition to that, much more aware of what's going on within the livestock industry. And again, for market pressures, the conditions in which the animals are brought to the slaughterhouse is no less problematic than the conditions in which they are actually treated in the slaughterhouse. And it became clear to me that there was far more cruelty involved in the production of meat today for the market than there was during our grandparents' or great-grandparents' time. Today, I think that even if you would argue, and I think it's very easy to refute the argument, but even if we were to be generous and allow for those that claim that there is a requirement sometimes to eat meat, whether on Shabbat and festivals, and let us say according to them this will be a mitzvah, which I say is easily debatable and I would say easily destructible as an argument. Nevertheless, it would today under present conditions be a mitzvah haba ba'avira, a legitimate end that comes through illegitimate means in terms of the production today. And I don't think, unless you have absolute farmyard conditions, as it was in a pre-modern society, I don't think there's any meat production today that can be legitimately called kosher because of these conditions in which we operate. But it's not just with regard to the production of, it's not just with the meat industry. There are all the barbarities involved today also with regards to the production of eggs. You probably know, I don't want to tell you too many horror stories for one day, but aside from the conditions under which the chickens are kept, you know that 50% of the production of the chicks that are born in terms of egg production, male chicks are immediately killed off because they're of no use in terms of the industry. And it's not as if they're killed off in a manner that you could say is humane, or at least not inhumane. They're put into either a grinder or into bags where they're suffocated, and this is mass production for us to be able to consume eggs. And if you take the dairy industry in terms of the condition of the animals, even in the better, and I would say in Israel it's not as bad as in some places of the world, but nevertheless, still, the conditions under which the cows are maintained, pumped with antibiotics and with hormones, which we'll come back to in a moment, because there are other ramifications to that, rendered very often incapable of appropriate mobility in many cases, but certainly subject to milking that is probably 25 times more frequent than a normal cow would have in its life. And they are impregnated in order to become, therefore, in order to lactate more and more. The moment the calf is born, the calf is taken away from them, which actually is in direct contradiction with a prohibition in the Torah that the child must be with its mother 7 days. It's true that our sages understand that to relate to the question of bringing the calf as an offering, but nevertheless that's not to negate the compassionate dimension, as Nachmanides also expounds with regards to that particular precept. So the conditions even in the dairy production today are way more inhumane than they were as generations passed. And so it becomes very difficult to argue as to how you can actually maintain a kosher diet today other than a plant-based diet. Of course, there are different gradations in that regard, and I'm not saying that you can compare exactly the killing of an animal to the exploitation of an animal. That's not exactly the same. But and we are all on journeys in our life. Nobody is ever perfect, and we can't do everything that we have to do in our life. But it seems to be very clear from an ethical point of view what we should be striving for, and what is consistent with the values that we spoke about, that we opened the Torah, that our sages say are precisely the purpose of kashrut, and that are designed to have an impact on our character and our personality. Today, even if we don't know about it, as most people don't, we are still party to enormous cruelty. And there is a prohibition within Judaism against being a party to something that is illegitimate. It is an expansion of the teaching in Leviticus 19, Vayikra Yutet, the words, Lifnei iver lo titen michshol. You shall not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And our sages understand that to mean to do anything that is causing people to transgress or to be invited to transgress without them choosing or really wanting to be able to do so. In other words, making them party to something that is a transgression. So today, I would say being party to the livestock production and to the animal products industry, to what's called animal farming, not industrial farming, factory farming, thank you very much, is definitely a question of lifnei iver lo titen michshol, if not things far more serious have expanded before. But there are other aspects to it as well, not least of all that it is a fundamental precept in Judaism that you have to be healthy. This is based on the teaching in Deuteronomy, V'nishmartem ma'od lenafshotechem. You must take care of your souls, and Maimonides Rambam expands on that extensively. Today, consuming products that have within them, now there are many problems today. Today it's impossible for us to be completely free of the invasion of some of negative products, whether these, as I say, antibiotics or hormones or other things that are injected. But obviously, the further down the food chain this is, the more intense it is, the more these toxins are multiplied. And therefore, the consumption of especially animal flesh is the most intense with regards to these hormones and antibiotics. So me, in those early days, where I started, when I became vegetarian, I should have been vegan much, much earlier, but I wasn't. For about 30 years, I was only vegetarian. And one of the other factors that led me in that direction was reading articles. There had been cancer in the family, and I was also reading the correlation between cancers and meat eating, and especially because of the question of hormones and antibiotics that are retained within the particular body. So there becomes another very obvious imperative in terms of Jewish teaching. But last but not least, that I come to, is the question of the fact of some of the ramifications in terms of the total environment of which we are a part. And there is a document that was produced by the United Nations, I think it's almost a decade ago, but there have been many since, but that was, if you like, rather path-breaking, and it was called Nature's Dark Shadow. I think it was Nature's the analysis of the animal industry, livestock's dark shadow. It's not nature's dark shadow. Livestock's dark shadow. And it actually already assessed then, and documentation since then has been even more dramatic, that the damage done to our environment by the livestock industry is greater than all the forms of transport in the world put together. First and foremost, there's a documentation of the damage done by methane gas. And methane gas is produced, which normally can be adequately absorbed, because of this enormous production of the livestock trade with all these animals. Therefore, from their flatulence, and as well as from the manure, there is this methane gas which is enormously polluting our environment and threatening our well-being broadly. But there are other ramifications. So the methane gas, I think, was assessed, if I'm not mistaken, in that particular document, as responsible for 15% of the pollution, which is an enormous amount. But then other studies then have to take into other account, because one of the other major factors, are not only the transport of the animals, but the waste of water and the waste of grain in the production and the destruction of the rainforests, which are enormous primarily to provide grazing for animals that are then slaughtered and can contribute only a portion of what that sustenance could provide in our society. So we live in a world where we have 30,000 children die every day as a result of direct or indirect malnutrition, where while we are wasting at least, therefore, 16 16 times the amount of natural grain there is, because it takes 16 times the amount of grain that you could use to feed people to produce that 1 kilo of beef in its own particular place. So just in terms of justice, of distributive justice in our world, our Western diet is actually criminally wasteful. And you have already heard from others wiser and greater than me in terms of these things of the prohibition of Bal Tashchit, probably the most central ecological environmental teaching in Judaism against wastage. And it's what Pope Francis rails against at our throwaway culture. And this is not just a question of wastage and therefore lack of respect for the cosmos, for God's creation and for his gifts that have been given to us. It's a lack of our responsibility towards the more vulnerable and the needy within our world. And this wastage, therefore, is preventing us from addressing issues of poverty as well as contributing to a greater environmental challenge for humanity at large. So 30% of the world's arable land is used for livestock, which consumes 8% of the Earth's fresh water. And so, as I said, meat-centered diets require up to 21 times more land area per person than would be required for a plant-based diet. So all of these are very dramatic factors that I think have very clear ramifications, should have clear ramifications, for those who are truly in consonance with the teachings that Judaism espouses with regards to our responsibilities to the world around us and towards God's creatures and towards our fellow human beings and towards ourselves in terms of our own responsibilities. It is today, as I say, environmentally irresponsible, but ethically, religiously, I would say criminal, to be party to an industry that is so contrary to the fundamental ethical teachings of our heritage. So, but just let me reiterate, we are all on a journey. We've all got to start somewhere. So nobody should give up to say it's too big for me. In any area we can always take small steps, and we can go step by step in this regard. And you know, there's no way out of it. I actually had an interesting discussion and debate within my family recently, and that is that a lot of one of the members of the family that is probably the most sensitive and advanced in terms of these issues raised the point that Alpro has now been taken over by, I can't remember what particular company, but it's a company that is involved in the dairy trade. It's a dairy company that's producing it. And even with regards to many of it, like I just now had a cup of coffee, which was very kindly made for me by Jonathan. Oh no, it wasn't made for me by Jonathan, it was made for me by Harvey. Thank you. And I had within it soya milk from Tanuva. But these are companies that are for part of the problem. So wherever we are, whatever we're doing, in some way we are caught up with the problem. But the counter-argument is that we should encourage even those that are the major perpetrators of the offences to at least reorientate themselves and to redistribute their sources. And therefore the fact that Tanuva is moving into plant-based products is something to be encouraged and therefore should be supported. So we've got the Torah, you know, is not, the Torah does not claim to be a book for perfect creatures. Our sages say time and again that the Torah was not given to angels, it was given to human beings. And therefore it takes into account the fact that we are weak and often problematic and often failing, always to some degree failing creatures. As it's written in Ecclesiastes, for there is not a man on earth who does only good and sinneth not. We are all failing by virtue of the fact that we are human beings. And the Torah takes that into account. The Torah legislates for divorce. Divorce is not an ideal, but the Torah takes into account that couples don't always succeed, and therefore it's better that they should separate than they should live together in conflict. And it's clear, says Rav Kook, that the whole area of kashrut is a concession. Rav Kook points out the fact that the Torah says in Deuteronomy with regards to the question of eating meat, if you say, and you shall say, I will eat meat because your heart lusts for meat, ki toveh nafshechem lechol basar. Lust is not a very positive concept. It's a recognition that there are needs, concessions need to be made for human weaknesses in those particular areas. And therefore the Torah takes into account our weakness. But what the Torah asks of us is always to strive to improve ourselves as much as possible every single day. And that, I think, is what Jewish people and other people who want to be consistent with the ethical teachings of their religious heritage and of our source must strive to do more and more, and that we should move as much as possible towards a plant-based diet to the degree that it's feasible for us. Yes, sir?
Is it possible to, in theory, to ethically, morally, religiously keep a non-plant-based diet? Or is the reasoning for having a plant-based diet merely in the practical aspects of the meat industry today, or is it more fundamental that even if, let's say, in getting from a sustainable farm that, you know, shucks their animals in the least humane way, is that in itself still unreligious, or is there a way of having a carnivorous diet that's ethical and moral and religious?
What is the issue of cloned meat from cells?
I think that's a separate issue. I mean, let's come back to it. But first of all, let me say to you that I don't believe that I can argue that a carnivorous diet that is in true farmyard conditions, where animals are treated compassionately and they are not treated as simply instrumentalized for human consumption and treated as barbarically as they are within the modern world, I cannot say that the Torah objects to that. It's clear that the Torah doesn't. And therefore, the people, who want to have animal products under the right conditions can do so. And I would not say that that contravenes the Torah. But I would say that today it's almost impossible in most places to be able to do so. But then I would say, I would be very much influenced by both the Abarbanel and Rabbi Yosef Albo, the author of the Sefer Ikarim, and of course by the writings of Rav Kook and the Nazir and the Kamenitzer Maggid, who all write that a plant-based diet is the Jewish ideal. Now, that's a very significant strain within Jewish tradition, but I would be deluding, I would be misrepresenting if I would claim that is a mainstream strain within Jewish tradition. It's not the mainstream, but it's a very powerful philosophy arguing on the basis of the sources, because the ideal societies in the Tanakh are the Garden of Eden and the Messianic Age. And the Garden of Eden is explicitly a vegan world, which is Adam and Eve only mandated to eat the fruits of the trees and vegetative sustenance. And if you take the vision in Yeshayahu of the Messianic Age with the wolf and lying down with the lamb and the lion with the kid and etc., so you have a vision of a society in which there is no need for there to be violence against any creature. And Rav Kook takes that literally, and he sees that particular vision. Rav Kook seeks to explain all the laws of kashrut in terms of the area of weaning us away from animal consumption. And that's the idea already in Abarbanel and in Albo, that the Torah seeks to wean us away. This is in consonance with Rambam's understanding of korbanot, Maimonides' understanding of sacrifices, which is based actually on Midrash Rabbah, on the Midrash on Vayikra, which basically says that essentially God sees that this was a need of the people, and therefore he says, if you need that particular way of worshipping, then do it this particular way in a manner that therefore will ennoble the spirit. And therefore all the areas that to do with the question of animal offerings or the question of even kashrut are interpreted within this particular strain within Jewish tradition as ways of weaning us away from our most base indulgences to a higher level. And I would say, in fact, while I introduced and said the whole of Judaism can be understood as mindfulness and should be understood as mindfulness, I would also say that the whole of Judaism should be understood also as taking our raw material and refining it. That's precisely the midrash that I brought. The mitzvot were given to refine a human being. Judaism doesn't have the ideal, which in other traditions is, to live a monastic existence and away from the material world. On the contrary, it sees that as a cop-out, and it wants the individual to be involved in the physical material world, but to be able to take those physical material indulgences and needs and refine them so that they elevate the human spirit. So I would say, identifying with that strain, that now even if you were to be able to place me and I was to be able to live within farmyard conditions which would be in consonance with Jewish ethical teaching, I would still not want to lead a carnivorous life now that I have successfully weaned myself off it.
What about eating eggs and milk?
So there I would say I can't see that there is any objection on principle in the correct farmyard conditions. And if, in fact, if from a personal point of view, the last summer I was up in the Austrian Tyrolean mountains, Alps, and I actually stayed somewhere where they actually had their own chickens and produced, and I did have an egg for about the first time in very, very many years for my breakfast, and I enjoyed it very much. Yes, sorry.
No, go ahead, Father.
So I'm a chemical engineer. So I find the whole vegetarian diet very challenging in today's world for other reasons. Because we have, I know my fellow students who worked in the biochemistry department, there is genetic manipulation of almost everything, especially soy. Is that ethically right? Is that we are playing with God's creation in that way? It is very difficult today to say we're living in a world where we are in sync with nature. We are not. Even when you're living on only vegetarian diet and we are oils, etc. It's we just clearing the rainforest to make room for these oils. There's all kinds of different things that we're doing with corn to take out the different parts of corn that causes us to eat more because it sort of overrides our natural hormone structure to know that we're full. So being a vegan, for instance, does not mean that you always look like you eat a healthy diet. It's very interesting that not infrequently do I see people who are living on a all vegan diet manage to eat too much because all the things that you then do instead eat is those type of things that are genetically manipulated, that are causing us to want to eat more. And that is also not in balance with nature. It is not such a simple world we're living in. It's not back in the day we have my cow, my 3 chickens, and in my backyard. We work in Africa. So last year I visited Burundi, which is the poorest country in the world. They're all subsistence farmers. It's very, very fertile, but they essentially eat no protein. They are very malnourished people because they eat bananas. That's their dinner, right? And they eat sweet potatoes, and that's their dinner. There's no animals around. It is, in a way, a very pure place. Spiritually, it feels very pure. It was very, the only place in Hutzlar where I feel close to God. But because there is essentially no animals, because there's no grazing grounds, there is no place to put them.
No, I understand your point.
So it's, whereas the next trip we went to was to the Maasai tribe in Kenya, which have 4 generations until very recently lived only on animal produce, only on their cows and what they give. They eat, though they're living in all this green, they planted nothing. So there's different forms of being human out there.
Absolutely.
And you can somehow live in very close proximity to nature and still, like the Maasai, still eat only animals.
So the problems you're raising, of course, are very real problems. And especially with regards to GM products. And of course, the Torah already deals with these issues with regards to the question of kalaim and shatnez and the prohibition against cross-breeding in different areas. If you like, in general terms, there should also be a guiding principle. Again,
you cannot be experts in everything.
We cannot do everything, and ever, as I said, and I reiterated, and I think I said maybe at least 3 times, we're all on a journey, and therefore we all should be striving to improve ourselves in certain ways, and we've got to deal with issues immediately around us. But I don't think the ramifications of GM are multifaceted. Yes, genetic and modifications, genetically modified foods, yes. But in terms of Jewish explicit teaching, there's still no comparison to the degree of desecration that we're talking about in terms of, therefore, of the animal production industry. It's nowhere near in terms of those particular dimensions. So we have to strive to do what we can, each according to their own abilities.
So I just want to ask a question. You mentioned about Pope Francis earlier in Laudato Si, which is, perhaps the most significant religious environmental teaching. And yet it doesn't call for veganism, it doesn't even call for vegetarianism, and there's, as I understand, almost no...
Probably not surprising, considering it was written by an Argentinian.
Right. So I understand that you meet with Pope Francis from time to time, and that you're also very close with Pope Benedict. In your conversations with them, have you discussed these issues, and if so, how has that gone?
First of all, I must tell you, with regard to Pope Benedict, he's virtually vegetarian. He is an unusually modest man. I would put him. I think Pope Francis is a wonderful man. But if I was to compare in terms of being a tzaddik with regards to lifestyle, I would probably give Benedict the upper standing in terms of his own particular lifestyle as a person. And from the information I have, and I've been once that I've been dining in the same room together with. No, I've actually been at the same table with him as well. I've dined twice with Pope Francis, and I would say in his defence that he consumes very little animal content, but he is still indulgent in that area. And I have told him that I look forward to the fact when we will welcome him into the vegan club. But and I can give you other examples of where I have totally failed to persuade him on certain issues, and some things of serious consequence in terms of Jewish-Catholic relations as well. He's a very determined man. I would say he has a very stubborn streak, and if he doesn't like what you're saying, he won't pay any attention to it. So I've got to keep on working on him.
Two things I want to add. The first is that you said that you think that killing animals is slaughtering, but you brought up halachic law, and that's the one thing. And the second thing about halachic law is that you call yourself a vegan, but you brought up halachic law, attributing the fact that it's not okay to kill animals at this time, or you don't think it's a right lifestyle. Why do we have to use both those terms if it is only attributed to halacha?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Why do you have to use the word vegan if it has nothing to do with veganism? It has to do with your perception of halacha.
But a vegan is simply describing what I'm doing. It means that simply it's another word for a person whose lifestyle is plant-based. And I'm saying that today that's consistent with the halachic teaching, with the halachic ideals.
Okay, fine. And you use the word slaughtering. And if you don't believe that let's say if you're doing everything in how halacha is supposed to be, then it's not considered slaughtering.
So what do you understand the word slaughter to mean?
I think I see it in a negative way.
So what alternative term would you use? When you thought of it, let me know, and I'll give it due consideration.
But you also use the most inhumane as one of your.
The conditions today, I would say, are most inhumane. I can't see how they can be more inhumane.
They can be, in a certain sense, halachically okay, and if that's halachically okay, then it's morally okay.
There is legitimate slaughter according to halacha.
So, in a certain sense, it's moral.
Yes, from the Jewish point of view, there are conditions, as I said to the question before. Yes, it could be. It's really interesting in terms of terminology. Within Judaism, there is legitimate killing. Killing in self-defense is legitimate. Right? There are, for Judaism, the sixth commandment is not, as the St. James Version has it, thou shalt not kill. It's thou shalt not murder.
This will be our last question.
So I appreciate everything you were saying today. It was very fascinating. I'm also vegan, and I currently go to a Litvish yeshiva. So my diet is often the topic of conversation and amusement. And so I often get the counter-argument that, well, spiritually speaking, we're uplifting the animal when we eat it. And oftentimes I rebut by citing a lot of the arguments you gave today. So I was just wondering if you could.
So first of all, if they're a Litvish yeshiva, they should not be utilizing Hasidic or Kabbalistic arguments that really don't come from the Litvish tradition.
That's true. It's a well-balanced yeshiva, which is fine there. But I was just wondering if you could address that point.
But as I don't consider myself to be a Kabbalist, and I'm not rooted within those particular ideas, first and foremost, I would advise you to read Rabbi David Sear's book,
A Vision of Eden.
A Vision of Eden, where he does deal extensively with that and different sources in that regard. But it's really interesting that even the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, thank you, who is therefore the source of Lurianic Kabbalah, which most Hasidic traditions are based upon, specifically states, based again on the Talmud, that the right way of life is not to eat meat. And you should, especially with regards to your yeshiva colleagues, refer them to that. Tell them to look in the encyclopedic work by Rabbi Chizkiah Medini, the Stei Chemed, and to look under the Stei Chemed, under the section that says Basar, and there he will see there they will find the sources that even from Kabbalistic origins say that this is only a concession and that those who can refrain from eating meat should do so. And that's also to be found within the source of the Mishnah Berurah also brings it in that regard. So there are other ways from a Kabbalistic concept of raising the nitzotzot, the sparks, without needing to have to kill animals in order to be able to do so. But even if they were still, there wasn't
any examples
how you'd be able to do it. So first of all, well, there are many different areas. So for example, obviously, we don't do that with non-kosher animals. So we're only talking about kosher animals. Kosher animals can be and should be used for plenty of other mitzvot. There's the question of the mezuzot on the doors, the question of tefillin, the question of sifrei Torah. You don't have to kill animals from that. They just have to be kosher animals. And in fact, dying naturally means that this should be a very positive method of recycling in which the aspects of therefore animals that have died naturally are used in a constructive way and therefore can be contributing to a Jewish way of life. But even if we accept their particular argument, and if there were not those counter-arguments, nevertheless, the question today is the conditions mean that it's not legitimately done. And there's a principle, ein mitzvah bab aveira. The aveirot involved today are far too serious to be able to brush off by saying, I'm simply raising the nitzotzot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Rosen.